welcome to the USC Institute on Inequalities and Global Health virtual lecture series. My name is Sophia Greskin, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to what I think is an incredibly exciting event, engaging with law and politics in a post-Roe world. Just to say up front, this event is done in partnership with the USC Law and Global Health Collaboration and our wonderful steering committee of folks from across the university who've been really concerned with the impact of the Dobbs decision, as well as the KSOM Center for Gender Equity in Medicine and Science. And so on our collective behalf, welcome. And let me start by saying that the varied impacts of the Dobbs decision, I think, have been weighing heavily on all of us. And today's dialogue is a part of a series of events that we've been hosting in the wake of the decision. And our hope through this event and through this whole series is to try to open space, not only for understanding this crazy landscape that we're living in, but also the various vantage points that we can use as we go forward into the midterms and beyond. And I guess my not so subtle message here is please vote, right? So those of us who have been with us over the last few months will remember that our first session was with the amazingly and newly minted MacArthur genius, Loretta Ross. And she framed the broader sets of issues we need to consider in terms of service delivery, in terms of policy, in terms of activism going forward. And you can find all this on YouTube, and I highly encourage you to do so. The second that we had was this incredible lineup to help us understand what Dobbs means for the provision of services, from a service provider's perspective in LA, but also across the US, and including in states that outright ban or severely restrict access, such as Indiana and Texas. And just last week, we had this incredible session on health equity at the global political level and the impact of Dobbs in terms of how we think about what this means for foreign policy, which brings us to the session today on the legal and political landscape, both in the US and globally, and something we haven't done before, which is a 30-minute session at the end, which is just for students to organize and engage around advocacy in terms of the midterms and beyond, so that there's a separate Zoom link that will be in the chat for students to come together at the end to be able to organize and to think through how it is that we want to work together. So before moving us into this amazing session, I have to say I could not ask for a better panel of leaders to be in dialogue with. And if it's okay with you all, I want to introduce you all at once and then move into the questions that are being put to the entire panel. And I do have to say to those of you online, I am not giving people their full due in terms of the kind of intros I'm giving. Everybody that's on this panel is amazing, and they have full bios that you would not believe, so please look them up. So I'm just going to introduce them very, very quickly, and I'll start with Aziz Ahmed, who is professor of law and R. Gordon Butler Scholar in International Law at the Boston University School of Law. And then go to Lourdes Rivera, who is Senior Vice President, U.S. Programs, Center for Reproductive Rights. Jody Jacobson, who is Senior Director, Foundation Relations and Senior Philanthropic Advisor, Movement Voter Project and Movement Voter Fund. And Esther Kishmodi, who is Chief Executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. So it's an amazing panel. And now to the questions. So if I can begin, can each of you orient us to the kind of work that you're doing to address the legal or the political environment around abortion access, just so folks can get a sense of who it is that you are? And Aziza, can I start with you? Just because you're on my panel that way, so is that okay?
Yes, yeah, thank you. And thank you so much, Professor Greskin, for inviting us to engage on this topic, which is so important, and one that you, of course, have also been a leader in for many, many decades. So I especially appreciate your voice here and leadership. I'm a professor, so I would say that in the wake of Dobbs, a lot of what has happened has been a reorientation of how we think about and learn about and teach about what's going on in the abortion landscape. And I think this has manifested in lots of student panels, a lot of organizing for students, a lot of really thinking with people about the possibilities in the context, thinking historically, thinking comparatively, thinking about how to bring the lessons learned from context outside of the United States and even in the American past back to our contemporary moment, in which once again, we're going to see, and we're seeing already, of course, many, many restrictions placed on abortion access. Another part of the work that I've engaged in has been sort of direct advocacy, of course, as many of us are doing, but also with local leaders in the Massachusetts area, as well as working with physicians to try to figure out what some of the this new landscape is going to mean for them, even in a state like Massachusetts, which is really working hard to protect abortion provision in this post-Dobbs moment. I'll leave it there because I know we have a lot of speakers.
That's awesome. Thank you. Jody, can I go to you next? Just because of where you are.
Absolutely. I am currently working with and for the Movement Voter Project, but just want to put a note there that any opinions I express here are my own. I am currently working as a donor advisor to move money quickly to grassroots organizing on democracy and basic rights in basically every state except Wyoming. And we work with roughly 400 groups throughout the country that are doing organizing at the state level and in communities, mostly in vulnerable communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ, et cetera. We are very heavily funding reproductive justice groups throughout the country, and we're involved in helping fund the Kansas initiative, for example, where the ballot initiative passed. So in so much as I think of abortion rights and every one of our rights as sort of secondary to democracy, in other words, you can't have those rights unless you have democracy, then we are working at the most basic level to expand and strengthen multiracial democracy, and through that to enable groups to work on the issues of greatest priority to them and intersectionally across issues.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Thanks. Lourdes, can I turn to you?
Yes, thank you, Sophia. Professor Greskin, I'm really delighted to be here with everyone. So I'm with the Center for Reproductive Rights. We are a C3 global legal human rights organization. We work in the United States within the human rights mechanisms, as well as in the Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Latin America and Caribbean regions. So our mission is really, we focus on legal strategies on law reform to advance reproductive rights as fundamental human rights, civil and constitutional rights around the world. And what we've been doing in response to Dobbs, we've been immediately after Dobbs doing harm mitigation, trying to block and slow down the state bans, and that's been working its way. We've been, and now we're pivoting to documenting the harms, fighting to preserve access where we can, and as well as building the path forward towards a more robust legal standard beyond Roe, to protect reproductive autonomy. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the work that we're focusing on. And I just want to add that, the legal advocacy, rule of law in our institutions like the courts are critical not only to reproductive rights, but also to a thriving democracy. And we're not going to cede this space. And at the same time acknowledging, as you're hearing on this panel, that there are other really important complementary and sometimes integrated strategies that are also critical, and that others are taking the lead on, like the folks here, from public health and social science research to culture change, narrative change, voter engagement, power building, and many others. And the legal strategies fit into this broader movement ecosystem. So I'm just going to kind of leave it at that, and we'll be coming back to some of the other pieces throughout the talk.
Totally. Thank you. Thanks so much. And Esther, yourself, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm a chief executive of Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters, that has been known as Reproductive Health Matters. We are a knowledge to action platform when we are producing rights and evidence-based knowledge and communicating it and connecting it to action. And I won't use slides, but I really would like to put my introduction that, so we are holding an evidence and rights-based scientific journal, and I just, in preparation of this meeting, and maybe provide a more global interdisciplinary context to you, I would like to share my screen that what has been produced, because it's so contextual about that, how we talk about abortion law reform. and abortion law changes, it's also affecting in so many disciplines. And I think those who are in the room would appreciate to understand that we started to publish, like many of other, can you see the screen, in 93,
Yes.
about making abortion safe and legal. And then abortion was basically the topic through the past 3 decades in relation to women fundamentalism and women empowerment, in terms of privatization, in terms of when the medical abortion pill came in terms of later on criminalization, started to talk about criminalization and how we produce evidence in relation to criminal laws, conflict and crisis situation. Most of the articles are about how women have access to safe abortion services. Privatization, when we produced in 2010, most of the articles came in relation to access to safe abortion services. When it comes to elimination of discrimination and stigma in health services, it's abortion that is the center of attention. When we produced in 2017 the disability and sexuality issue, the disability and women's rights movement expressed most concerns in relation to abortion services. And now we are producing about digital health, COVID, and again, we are getting so much article knowledge, concern, political analysis about how people have or don't have access to services depending on the laws and how it plays out.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks. I mean, it's clear there's so many different directions we can go in this conversation, right? So I guess I want to take us back to the US for a moment here and just say that it's clear that the Dobbs decision isn't going to impact everybody in the US equally. And I think this is particularly true for the many poor women, many who are Black and Latina, who are already living without real access to abortion services. So, even when there is good law, there is often a gap between what's written on paper and what happens in practice. And this is a reality also in other parts of the world. And I guess I want to start, Aziza, with you again, sorry. If you can start us off by talking about these inequalities as you see them both pre and post Dobbs. And then I'm very excited to hear from others as well. Aziza, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, one of the things that was real, and one of the things that reproductive rights activists used to talked about all the time in the pre-Dobbs moment, was that actually post-Roe, the decriminalization of abortion, many women around the country, especially, as Jody already said, Black women, immigrant women, women of color, poor women, of all races, really had a hard time accessing abortion. One of the reasons this was true was because states continued to regulate abortions, and some states more severely than others. And a lot of the state-by-state regulation and a lot of the sort of tricks that were deployed by the right in the guise of making clinics safer actually led to clinic closures. They were called targeted regulation of advocacy providers. Clinic closures and fewer clinics meant that abortions were hard to access. Informed consent laws also passed under the guise of sort of giving women information about their abortion, made it so that women weren't able to access abortions immediately, even if they were able to successfully arrive at a clinic. They would have to take time off of work. They might even have to wait a few days if there was a waiting period in the state. And so people just couldn't get to abortion clinics. If they needed the abortions, they were far away. They were often met with barriers. Then there was the reality of misinformation, the crisis pregnancy centers that had cropped up all over the United States, which actively gave women misinformation, dissuaded them from getting their abortions, engaged in fraudulent tactics, pretending to be clinics, et cetera, to discourage women from getting abortions. And on top of all of that, too, was the reality that some women were sort of ensnared in the criminal justice system in the context of either trying to self-induce abortion. The National Advocates for Pregnant Women is an important organization that's been leading on this issue for a long time. Or if there was another thing like drug use, for example, that they might be being prosecuted for, their pregnancy would get implicated in that. So already many poor people in the United States, poor women and women of color, other folks were unable to get the care that they needed. There's this, I wrote a little blog in Ms. Magazine because something I was thinking about a lot when Dobbs happened about this, because something that I was thinking about a lot when Dobbs happened is this invocation in critical race theory a long time ago by Lani Guinier and her co-author that, people of color are canaries in the coal mine. And, you can see the fissures of democracy when we think about what's happening to people of color in the United States and how they're going to ripple. And Dobbs kind of made that very real, because now suddenly, of course, we're going to see inequalities in how the post-Dobbs landscape plays out, but many more women will be subject to prosecution in the vein that many poor women had been for so long, many women of color. Even if, and it's true that, wealth will be able to, afford some women the opportunities to leave the state for abortions or be able to access abortion elsewhere. But there will be many teenagers, for example, who are not necessarily poor, but can't simply leave the state because of their parents' watchful eyes, or women who show up at clinics who are having an ectopic pregnancy, who don't have the time to get to another state to deal with their issues. So, so there's a lot to think about there, but it is very true that we are going to continue to see the disparate impacts we saw before. We're going to sort of discrimination, the inabilities to get access before. We're going to see it again now, and also see the sort of broadening and that kind of impact in other communities as well.
Totally hear you. Any additional reflections on this question or from what Aziza has said?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that, Roe and Casey were important to defend, and we're seeing the dire consequences of losing them now. And at the same time, I totally agree with what Aziza laid out. There were and are, disproportionate impact of, how the failures of Roe and Casey and not really guaranteeing access, right? And then just the other aspect I just want to add is that, in the US is the only industrialized country in which maternal mortality is increasing and getting worse. And the majority of these maternal deaths are actually preventable. According to the CDC, Black and Indigenous women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes than white women. And even in Mississippi, that passed the 15-week ban, and it was the subject of the Dobbs case. When they passed it, they professed to be protecting women's health, and yet, it has some of the worst and most alarming infant and maternal mortality rates in the country. And this was something that was not lost on the Mississippi District Court judge who blocked the law initially. But then that, the Supreme Court then upheld in the Dobbs opinion. And none of these issues were addressed by the Supreme Court's majority opinion, which mentioned the state legislature 6 times, but, mentioned women and pregnant people 0 times. So this is just indicative why it's really imperative that everyone, and especially those who experience the worst indignities and discrimination, have the ability to make their own decisions about pregnancy and reproductive health services, and to actually have the services that they need.
100%. Jody?
I would just add one quick thing to everything, double tap on everything that Aziza and Lourdes have said. Just to remember that U.S. abortion policy has always been inherently racist. You have the Hyde Amendment, which purposefully was put in place in order to deny, Henry Hyde said it, we do not want poor women getting abortions. So it's, when we talk about Roe and we talk about, codifying Roe, it's the wrong conversation to be having. We need to talk about what we need to do to codify the rights and access to abortion care for everyone. And I can speak later to some other concerns I have about the same thing, but I just wanted to double tap on that and just remind people that we've inherently accepted the racist nature of access to services in healthcare generally, but in abortion and sexual reproductive health care.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah. Esther, anything to add from a more global perspective?
I think it's very important to point out, and I would recommend to visit the WHO Safe Abortion Guidance document that has been just published, that evidence is out there that What you said just in relation to the US situation now, it has been observed in the past decade in countries when abortion laws are restricted and where abortion is criminalized. And also very important public health data is pointing to the fact that restriction and criminalization of abortion laws does not lead to less abortion access and less utilization of abortion services, but affecting safety and contributes to inequalities and increases vulnerabilities and marginalizations of those who are already marginalized based on socioeconomic status, racial and other background, how people are already discriminated within the country. So this is already realized all over. So I think in the US, it was very important, but I will come back that it is clearly an ideology-based decision that is completely rejecting very solid public health evidence that is already warning against criminalization and restriction of unjust restriction of abortion laws.
Thanks. I mean, let me come back now to the legal landscape. I really appreciate all of your comments. And I'm just thinking, you know, part of the legal landscape is what's done by legislative bodies. Another is how the courts are being used. There's all of the interplay with the issues that you all have been raising. You know, can you each speak to what's happening in these domains in the current moment, and both, you know, the efforts that are being made to decrease access, right, which I think we're aware of it, but also those that are trying to increase access, because I think there's some interesting examples there as well. And perhaps, Lourdes, can I ask you to start us off? Maybe share the tracker or whatever it is that you'd like to do to help start the conversation.
Yeah, you know, before I do that, I just want to just talk about the Dobbs opinion a little bit. You know, so the center litigated the Dobbs case that overturned Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And I just want to name that this is the first time that the Supreme Court has actually taken away an established liberty right. And in human rights parlance, this is a retrogression of rights, and the US now joins the only other 3 countries in the world that has taken away you know, legal protections for abortion. So now we're in the company of El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Poland, and 58 other countries since 1994 have expanded or added legal protections for abortion. And, you know, we believe this was a wrongly decided opinion that looked back to the 1800s and even into the dark ages to determine what our rights should be today. And even as it looked back into the 1800s, it was a selective read of history and tradition to reach a result. And it ignored the extensive evidence, the kind of evidence that Esther was just talking about in the record, you know, about what was happening at that time in the 1800s. You know, it was women's history. It was, you know, African-American and Black people's history. You know, the court ignored all of that. And what the Supreme Court did was so alarming that the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association that submitted an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the Dobbs case on behalf of Jackson Women's Health, presenting that relevant history, they issued a statement after Dobbs saying, quote, "The court adopted a flawed interpretation of abortion criminalization that has been pressed by anti-abortion advocates for more than 30 years. The opinion inadequately represents the history of the common law, the significance of quickening in state law and practice in the United States, and the 19th century forces that turned early abortion into a crime." And then these organizations go on to say that it's imperative that historical evidence and argument be presented according to high standards of historical scholarship. The court's majority opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson does not meet those standards and has therefore established a flawed and troubling precedent. So, you know, it's really important then to contextualize and name you know, the Dobbs opinion, and now, you know, and that to, you know, to show you, some of the consequences of this. And if I can figure out how to share my screen, I will do that, because I just did that in a few minutes ago. I just need to move this over here. And share. Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, so the center is tracking and analyzing in real time the ever-changing landscape post-Dobbs. This is our interactive map called After Roe Fell. So since June 24th, which was the Dobbs decision, 18 states have been seeking to enforce complete abortion bans. 12 are in effect. That's represented in the brownish reddish color. In the red, there are another 14 or so states that are still very hostile. This is what Aziza was talking about in terms of all of those states that have passed laws upon laws to shut down clinics, to make very onerous requirements that have nothing to do with guaranteeing quality of care for health services. And the map shows progress. You were alluding to this, Professor Gruskin. There has been progress that has been made. That's shown in orange and yellow and the teal color states. They represent successful legal advocacy or organizing and legislative advocacy work to either remove legal barriers, like represented in orange, like in New Mexico and Virginia, to add legal protections, like in Colorado and Kansas, or to expand access, like in Illinois and Minnesota, that's represented in the teal color. And the center, with our partners, we're going to continue to work to expand on this hard work, to increase the number of states, with state constitutional protections like Kansas, or other legal protections, and including, for those who have to seek care crossing state lines. And of course, we understand that, not everybody's going to be able to leave their states. But we need to also build towards a more robust legal framework beyond Roe, that protects reproductive autonomy, that's inclusive, but beyond abortion rights and access. And we might see in Michigan, for example, they might become, yellow in November if the voters adopt the ballot initiative that will amend the state constitution. And we were also very excited that Kansas voters, in August, they declined to overturn the Kansas State Supreme Court's opinion that we secured to establish the strongest level of constitutional protections, strict scrutiny for abortion rights. There's a lot more work to do, but we offer this map so that you can keep track of what's happening state by state.
That's super helpful. And it's super helpful for everybody, I think, online to see that and know that this is a resource that we can point to. And I appreciate so much that you keep it up to date. You know what I mean? Like in terms of kind of what's happening. Jody, anything to add to what Lourdes has said? You're muted though, and I'm sure what you're saying is fabulous, but you're muted. Yep.
Sorry, my dog was barking and I didn't want to interrupt everybody. The only thing that I would add, and what Lourdes is showing us, is that the elections in the midterms are so critical to all of this. If we have a governor in Georgia who will veto further abortion restrictions in that state, it's a different story than if we have a governor who's going to expand abortion restrictions in that state, as Kemp will if he wins. If we have a governor in a place like Arizona, a conspiracy theorist / election denier then we will see further restrictions in forcing the ban that went into effect, 100-year-old ban or whatever it was. So I think that, again, the election right now, it's not just the national House and Senate federal races, but the state level races that are so critical. Attorneys general races are really critical because they will determine who will or will not enforce laws. Many attorneys general who are not in favor of enforcing abortion bans will not do that. But there are other attorneys general that will use the full force of their office to go after people who seek abortion care.
Totally hear you. As Aziza, anything on this? Okay.
No, oh, sorry. I was just
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, Jody's probably really the expert here who can speak to this, but I just wanted to throw into the conversation too, the reality that we have all this background stuff going on in the voting rights space. So all the gerrymandering and just the inability of people to vote, this video that's been released about this election policing that's going on in Florida right now, I think one of the hard things about saying, oh, we can go to the legislature and sort of work, do this with our feet in the voting booths, is that we're living in a moment in which the voting rules are being reconfigured so that, it's not even clear that the legislatures are necessarily acting in the way that the people want them to act.
Yeah.
Well, I think, can I say something to just that point very quickly? That is, like, in Florida is a really good example, because there was a overwhelmingly passed ballot initiative in Florida in 2018 to give previously incarcerated people, returning citizens, their rights back to vote. And what you saw in that video from Florida yesterday was the product of the state legislature basically undoing that ballot initiative and putting in conditions for returning citizens to vote that are so confusing and so boggling that people are confused and they're getting arrested for that purposeful confusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, so on that, I think, Jody, can I stick with you for a minute here then, right? If that's okay. I do think, I think everybody would be really grateful for your take on the political landscape, kind of just more generally. I mean, in terms of what you talked about in terms of Florida, but just in terms of the attorney generals, I mean, all those things that you started to raise. Heading into the midterms, I mean, nothing feels more urgent right now, right? So what are the things that you're seeing that you think we should all be aware of? And importantly, what are the actions that you think we need to be made most aware of?
So the actions are really basic at this point, because we're basically less than a month out, right? The actions that people can take are the things I'm doing with my spare time. I'm getting out and door knocking. I'm calling for people. I'm giving what I can, money wherever I can. But every House race, any city council race, any state AG race, wherever you are, and I'm not talking about just in red states, I'm talking about California as well. We need to be all out for pushing for people who are fact-based, legally based people that will promote justice and not seek to use the law to further constrain the rights of people. One thing I'm very concerned about is, and I'm particularly concerned that the Democrats have adopted this. I was just speaking with someone who's in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, talking about how Josh Shapiro, for example, who's running for governor in Pennsylvania, has adopted these talking points about policing from the Republican Party. Well, guess what? The same police that we are increasing the budgets of, with which we already have problems of fascism and state-sanctioned violence and problems with policing, are the same police who are arresting people for abortion care. So, we have a real problem that is multidimensional and that will only grow over time. And what we saw yesterday, there was an ad by Eric Swalwell that went around. I think it's had several million views at this point, sort of looking into the future of abortion restrictions and what would happen. And it featured police coming to arrest a woman who had had a miscarriage. And I think that we already know that has happened even before the fall of Roe in certain states, but we are looking at a place where we are either electing people who can be swayed and can be lobbied and will look at facts and will accept them, or people who have an agenda that is predetermined to basically demolish all of our rights, including LGBTQ rights, transgender rights, everything. So the only thing I can say is that the landscape across the board is to elect Democrats wherever you can, even if you don't like that particular Democrat, because you can lobby that particular Democrat and move them along. Whereas the other folks, we may not have an election system after they're elected.
Wow. Okay, I hear you. Aziza, anything to add to that? No, it's kind of all encompassing, right? Lourdes, please, anything? So Esther, I was, okay. Thank you, Jody. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we got to get out there and vote, right? So let me try to broaden out now, if I may, and, talk about, let's start with kind of global standards. And, we have the UN and the human rights mechanisms that have been really strong in terms of increasingly putting reproductive rights and bodily autonomy really at the top of the human rights agenda. We have WHO in terms of the safe abortion guidance that Esther mentioned at the beginning. The thing is that this reversal of Roe is really, both within our country and more globally, really not just decreasing access, it's also seeking to stigmatize people who seek access, right? And at the same time, there seems to be amazing activism already happening in many, many parts of the world. And I guess, Esther, can we start with you? It's kind of a two-parter, but what do you think we can learn from the human rights and the legal landscape in other parts of the world?
I would just spend 1 minute on the global standards, because I think it's very important to take note that these global standards developed over the past 30 years, and they are not developed out of colonization and the Western colonization of telling what the human rights standards supposed to be. It was a very careful, rigorous development of human rights standards based on public health and multidisciplinary evidence, observing, for example, the correlation between maternal mortality and restrictive laws, and how actually it was published in 2010, that showing that how the restrictiveness of abortion laws is contributing to high maternal mortality. And over the past 30 years, treaty monitoring bodies, also regional courts, reached conclusions like there is now a massive human rights standards on absolute decriminalization of abortion, because it's showing, as I said, absolute harmful effects on many ways on people's and women and girls' life, and the inequalities. Human rights standards are calling for access to safe abortion services on different grounds and access to information. Also would like to mention the nuances that it's also important there are regulations in relation to conscientious objection, in relation to stigma and discrimination. So human rights standards are massive. The US decision is violating all human rights standards that exist all over, across of CEDAW, Human Rights Committee on the Rights of the Child, European Convention, Inter-American Convention, whatever standards you can call, this decision is violating international human rights standards. On the other hand, it's very important to observe that the US, and this session is called the politics, because how abortion is regulated is highly related to politics. And if you look at political changes, you also observe that it's very contextual nationally. And we may say that populist governments are contributing to most restrictive laws. At the same time, you also see that there is some kind of respect of this kind of human rights standards, establishing reproductive justice, protecting, giving equality to women, that however ideology-based national politics are, it's more progress is observed in Argentina, in Colombia, in India, in Benin, in Thailand, across the globe. How abortion access is provided and how positive legal changes are observed is really depends on the constitutional, legal, social, cultural settings. So most recently, for example, Benin, one of the few African countries who liberalized abortion recently. they are still arguing with very strong public health grounds. And they are basically the government, with the parliament, with the professional association, came to a conclusion that it's still 20% of its unsafe abortion is responsible still 20% of maternal deaths in Benin. That is very, very high. That's why we have no any other option but to decriminalize and liberalize abortion. So it was not an ideological decision, it was a public health decision. If you are going to, and maybe someone else, maybe Lourdes, you could talk about Colombia and Argentina, but I also wanted to bring the example of India. And just a week ago, 2 weeks ago, there was a Supreme Court decision that argued on the basis of discrimination, non-discrimination, providing access to safe abortion services to unmarried women on the basis of equal to married women. But it exists in the context that India, that is a very complex political environment, not necessarily liberal on many grounds, but India in 2021, on the 50th anniversary of the Termination of Pregnancy Act, the parliament comprehensively revised the act to ensure access to women to safe and legal abortion without compromising the safety and quality of care, arguing with securing dignity, autonomy, confidentiality, and justice for women who need to terminate pregnancy. So you see a country when all of this rights, like there is an agony of, is this decision in relation to reproductive justice or not? Is this relation is protecting autonomy or not? When there is a country of India and Benin who is like, it's a right to health, it's a bodily integrity, it's a choice, it's a reproductive justice matter, path, Supreme Court decision from Benin, Thailand, India, Argentina, Colombia. I also would like to recognize that other types of regress and the impact of the US decision in other countries, like Hungary, that is a very small country. On the other hand, it can be very impactful worldwide. Like, for example, it was a pioneer of starting the anti-gender movement. So Hungary, we didn't know why and how in 2012, out of the blue, introduced the protection of the fetus in the constitution, protection of the rights of the child from conception in the constitution. Nothing else happened. The very liberal abortion law was untouched. Right after the Dobbs decision came out, 1 month later, introduced a regulation overnight without any discussion about a Heartbeat Act. But people don't even understand why. It's out of context. Abortion was available for decades in Hungary. And now there are regulations in relation to conscientiousness objections. And there is an observation that in Hungary, I'm Hungarian, when abortion was really accessible, it's like if you see a poll, 2/3 of the population or more agrees with abortion, doesn't even think about and question it. Now midwives are not available to provide counseling until the 12 weeks of the pregnancy. So very similar trends on this regard. What is dangerous about it, that it's not necessarily a Supreme Court decision that will lead to restriction of abortion services, but clandestine regulative restrictions also can deprive women completely from access to safe abortion services. I just talked to Croatian colleagues who has similar liberal abortion laws, when basically and practically abortion services are not available in the country because of stigma and unavailability because of conscientiousness objection of abortion providers. So in the best case scenario in Croatia, women has to go to Austria or neighboring countries, and those, as you mentioned, Jody, adolescent, women with disability, those who cannot afford to travel, has zero access to services in a country contracts when the abortion law context is on paper liberal. on the other hand, other regulatory barriers are depriving women from access. So I think when we talk globally and when we look at the global landscape, we need to see laws and policies and politics in a very strong interaction. And I think what we learned from this decision that we cannot really sleep. Like we cannot assume just because you have an abortion law that is liberal, it means that tomorrow or 1 year or 5 years, you will have access to safe abortion services. So I think it's a wake-up call for the global abortion movement that how we need to document the laws, regulations, and the political changes across.
Super helpful, Esther. Thank you. Other additions in terms of this question? Lourdes, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Esther, for that. So I think, I'll start with the US and then I'll talk a little bit about Colombia. So here in the US, we've been very grateful, actually, that there's been such a high level of engagement and response from the global human rights community condemning the Dobbs decision. These have included statements and expressions of concern from UN, regional human rights experts, and global leaders, emphasizing that, as you were saying, Esther, that abortion is protected by human rights, and that the U.S. regression on abortion rights is counter to the global trend towards more protections for abortion rather than less. And acknowledging that the court's decision will have really devastating impact, particularly on communities already experiencing discriminatory access to healthcare. So so this is being really recognized by the global community, and the support from the global community is really important on a number of levels, including to combat this narrative, and also a proposed legislation that in order for the U.S. to be in line with the rest of the world, that we need a national gestational ban of 15 weeks, for example, which is contrary to the global trends and human rights standards, and also to try to help to limit the harm of the U.S. retrogression globally, like you've been that you just described. And so it's really this important dialogue that's happening. And I'll just mention one more thing about the US, which is this summer, well, the Convention to End Racial Discrimination is one of the three international treaties that the US has actually ratified. And because of that, the US has to go before the UN mechanisms and report, on their record and be held accountable. And so we with other partners brought a delegation, and there were other groups from the US talking about a whole range of issues, but we brought a delegation that talked about the Dobbs decision, also on maternal health disparities. And it was the first time that the CERD committee talked about abortion as a race discrimination issue. So so that was very exciting because it helped reinforce that this is a human rights concern, but also we were able to help contribute to further norm building. So that was a very exciting thing. And just to talk about Colombia, and I just want to hold up my Causa Justa prop, and I know Professor Ruskin, you have your green handkerchief too. So and the Green Wave, is a movement that started in Argentina from modeled after, Las Madres who protested against the disappearance of, their children and grandchildren under the really brutal dictatorship. And, they wore the white handkerchiefs. And so the abortion right advocates modeled their movement after that, but chose green as a different color, to claim life, to claim green as a color as the right to life, for women. So this has been a movement that has gone from Argentina to Mexico, Colombia, and in Colombia, this was a multi-year effort that was part of this Causa Justa, which is a movement of 90 civil society organizations more than 150 advocates throughout the country, including feminist organizations, international organizations, healthcare providers, scholars, research centers, and others. And this movement built on an earlier win in the Constitutional Court from 2006. It was a case brought by Women's Link Worldwide that decriminalized abortion within certain narrow circumstances. And then, for the next case, as part of this Casa Justa movement, the center partnered with Women's Link, La Mesa por la Vida y Salud de las Mujeres Católicas por el Derecho a Decidir, and Grupo Médico por el Derecho a Decidir on the legal component of the strategy. And it was all these efforts together that resulted in the decriminalization of abortion up to 24 weeks by the Constitutional Court in February of 2022 of this year. So, that's really, very exciting. And there were, other examples around the world, in Ireland and, in Kenya. And I think, it's really important, for us here in the US to draw inspiration, from these other examples where people have been able to push back or build in very conservative or sometimes even more hostile environments, and not be discouraged, and draw some of those lessons.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jody, do you want to add anything?
I would just add that, we also have a movement now for making sure that people can access Plan C, which is medication abortion, and that would be self-managed abortion. And that movement of advocates, doctors, providers across the country is really working hard to make sure that anyone who wants to access medication abortion can do so.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, Aziza, anything to bring in?
Yeah, sure. The only, I loved everything that was said so far. And I would add that, I do think we're in a shifting moment where, there was a way in which I think what we did in the United States as activists, and in terms of our the types of legal challenges we would bring, was almost like the gold standard in some ways. There's a way in which the American fight was sort of heralded as a fight to copy around the world. But I think what we've really learned in this moment is that actually, the things have shifted, and really American activists need to look to Argentina and Argentinian feminists, Colombian feminists, Mexican feminists, Irish feminists to see, how they sometimes, I think, even, well, not sometimes, really in the face of even more opposition, in the United States, the medical establishment is on our side. Politics, the majority of Americans agree that abortion ought to be liberalized. We have all this power behind the feminist movement here, unlike in many of these other country contexts in which it was like the church and the doctors and the, politicians were all against this fight for abortion access. And I feel like there's so many lessons to learn, and it's important for us to start to build those bridges and make sure that we're sort of being modest as Americans, and remembering that we have to look to the global South and other places where there's been recent victories, and take lessons from there around, especially around organizing and activism.
So
Yes.
yeah, so guys, does somebody want to add something to that?
No, that was just my jazz hands for what Aziza was saying.
100%. Let's all do jazz hands out of that, but yeah, exactly. So I do want to end on a positive. I hope a positive, in the sense that I really want to talk about activism efforts, because I think right now we can all become so demoralized in terms of kind of the way that things are going. And so if each of you could speak somehow to the activism efforts that you're aware of, but more importantly, kind of like where you really think that strategies are needed and kind of the approaches that we should be taking. And I'd like to hear from everyone. I also want to point out before I do that, that there are several questions in the chat that are really useful and interesting. And it would be great if folks could on the panel can kind of respond to those. And if not, I'll try to bring them out. But I would just love to hear some kind of strategic thinking from each of you in terms of activism. And just because Jody, where you are, can I start with you just because of where you are on my screen? Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. You know, this is a big question because there's activism around federal law and, you know, there's activism around what we want the courts to look like, whether we expand the Supreme Court, which has, you know, implications for many different areas of law and policy that have many different equity and health issues. There's advocacy around the media and making sure that we don't allow the media to continue to go down a pathway that they've created of false equivalencies between people who feel something is wrong or don't use public health evidence and then people who are using public health evidence. You know, I like the example, we think all of this is new, but when I was working on HIV and AIDS legislation and policy earlier in the 2000s, you know, we had Senator Dr. Frist go out and make public comments time after time in the media that were absolutely false about the transmission of HIV and AIDS. And the media treated it as, well, that's what he believes. And so I think we have to really have a full-throated, multi-variable advocacy movement that focuses on strengthening law and policy wherever you are. And if it's starting in your town or your county, do that. If it's at your state level, do that. Work at the federal level, get the media, focus on how media is failing us, and also get Democrats to be more bold. Because when you have a party that is driven to one goal, that is total control over everybody's lives, and you have another party that's kind of like, well, we don't really know what we feel, and we don't know how to talk about it, and we can't even answer a question about later abortion, then you're going to lose because people are going to hear repetitively from this one other more, you know, sort of directed group.
Yeah, I hear you. Aziza.
Yeah, thank you, Jody. That was really helpful. I think I've been thinking a lot about, I mean, it's so hard to answer this question because there's so much that has to be done right now, you know, but something I've been thinking about is how to view this moment as an opportunity. You know, I think for a lot of us in the reproductive justice movement, both in the United States and globally, we spent a lot of time, you know, over the last 30 years critiquing reproductive rights in a lot of ways, you know, for its lack of inclusion, for its choice framework, for its inability to let, you know, women who are affected lead. And, you know, there's so many things that we can sort of, I think, sort of rise from the ashes, I suppose, and use this as an opportunity to say, well, how could we build back a sort of better reproductive justice platform that is, you know, not only inclusive, but, you know, complete and thinks about the big questions that we actually care about in this movement, including economic inequality and redistribution and all of the sort of the whole constellation of things that actually makes it possible for someone to live a full life from a reproductive health perspective and get the care that they need when they want it, and not just focus on abortion too. You know, how do we make sure it's all the various health issues and are kind of connected? So, you know, I think a lot about that, and I think something I worry about is that we're not already just headed down the path of reproducing the same again. You know, the way we're already sort of in this defensive position, you know, and put this, you know, we have to have shield laws, of course, but in some of the states, but of course, you know, how do we make sure that while we're in this like offensive posture and fighting this fight, we also can do some of the work to make the whole movement stronger.
Yeah, I got you. Lourdes, next.
Yeah, thank you. You know, and I want to answer it kind of like high level and then a little bit more nitty gritty. You know, so, you know, first of all, acknowledging that there are many parts to play in the movement, right? And all of it needs to happen. For us at the center, we're focusing on legal advocacy and reform because that's what we do, right? That's our expertise. So, the way we're going to approach this, the way we are approaching and have been approaching is that, working with partners in states with grass tops, and also focusing on, documenting the harms. We have to lift up what people are actually experiencing. Building over time what Aziza is talking about, which I think of it as, the legal framework that actually supports reproductive justice, right? And so, the right and the public support for reproductive autonomy that's inclusive, but beyond the right to abortion and access, including maternal health, including the right to assisted reproduction, the right to contraception, like all of this, right? And of course, there are other issues that are beyond our mission, but that, others can also kind of bring to this, while, protecting access to abortion in as many states as possible, including with some of these interstate shield laws, which is not a long-term solution, but they're important to help people today, and to protect the ability, the right to travel, right? The constitutional right to travel, we have to protect that. We're advocating for the Women's Health Protection Act that actually, I saw that there was a question about, what's codifying Roe, and I think that there's some of the language that's being used is kind of like a generic framework for this, right? And I think some people are saying codifying Roe to refer to the Women's Health Protection Act, but the Women's Health Protection Act doesn't just guarantee rights; it guarantees access, right? And then the EACH Act guarantees the funding, the public and private health insurance for it, right? So these are all different pieces that we need. There's a whole lot of other work that needs to be done for access for young people, right? So this is all part of the project that's needed. And I just want to say that so our, forgive me, I'm a lawyer, but our Constitution, it was brilliant, right? It was like the most brilliant document, of its time, right? And at the same time, it has some original sins that it started with, right? It had a fugitive slave provision. It didn't use those words, but it was in there. It was part of the original Constitution. But, part of the brilliance of the Constitution, despite what, some of the folks from like Federalist Society say, it was designed to evolve. It was actually designed to evolve. And our project really needs to be to create a much more compelling constitutional vision of equality and rights, for everyone and not just the privileged few. The way I think about it, when I woke up on, the day after the Dobbs decision, I was like, what just happened here? What happened here is that my daughter, right, is an equal person under the Constitution in some states and not other states. Yet other people, and you can fill in who the other people are equal people under the Constitution in every state. What's wrong with this picture? And I think that people really need to understand that, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can make a much more compelling vision of what this Constitution needs to be in this country. That's the project.
Thanks. You're all amazing. Esther, final word from you, and then I will close us up. And I appreciate everybody who's hanging with us, please.
I will be very brief because I know we are out of time, but I think just following on Lourdes, I think when the rest of the world woke up the next morning, I think it was an incredible shock worldwide and incredible fear that if it can happen in the US, then it can happen anywhere, because the US was the safeguarder of democracy and human rights, and including women's rights. So if it falls in the US, it can fall anywhere. And I think at the same time, since I need to end on the positive note, we can also observe in the past 3 months or so an incredible wake up of the sexual and reproductive rights and justice movement. And I think it's a momentum of a real momentum. So it's not ICPD plus 30, it's about now. We need solidarity. And I think because of the decision shows and highlights what is happening, the incredible inequalities, and not only in relation to race, but as we said, it's how marginalization of migrants, of refugees, of people living with disabilities, with adolescents are marginalized. There is a cross-movement solidarity is growing around sexual and reproductive rights and justice, not only, as Jody said or Lourdes said, not only around abortion, but in general about sexual and reproductive rights that is cross-sectorial as well. And I think it's almost the first time when the lawyers has real conversation with the service providers, and the service providers with the policymakers and with the communities. So it is really a momentum to do something differently and better and together. So thank you.
Thanks for that. And that's thank you for that nice kind of move into the future. I need to close, and I just need to say, it's been incredibly helpful listening to you all. I mean, it's inspiring, but it's also helpful, right? And it really is, in terms of just being able to think when we're confronted with so much of what's happening right now, when we think about this narrowing space for reproductive choice, to be able to think about the things that one can do. And, you know, at IIGH, at the Institute, we're really committed to trying to be a space to have urgent action around these issues. And this kind of dialogue is critical. I mean, we are going to have now a student activism session that is only for students, with the rest of us are not invited, to try to figure out essentially how best to engage in this landscape now having heard everything that's here. And so that information, I believe, is in the chat in terms of how to get that Zoom link. And with that, I just want to say thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to you in the audience for being part of this. And I'm going to emphasize what Jody, what Lourdes, what Aziza has said, which was vote. We all must get out and vote. So it's never been more urgent. And these are the next two events that we have coming up. And with that, just thank you, everybody. And please take good care.